In rugby, it's just less so. And we know our place. We're never going to brag and say that we're the number one sport in England and stuff like that. We're not. It's way out there. Soccer's streets ahead of us. I was asked a question recently that sounded pretty simple. Who are the 5 rugby players I love the most? And I thought, well, that's actually easier than asking me who the 5 greatest were. You start talking about the greatest players and everybody's got an opinion. Especially rugby people will argue about anything. But the blokes you love playing with, that's different. That's personal. I played rugby for a long time, long enough to share changing rooms with all sorts of characters, some very serious ones, some complete lunatics, and I probably belonged somewhere in the middle, maybe closer to the lunatics. But there were certain blokes I just enjoyed being around. It wasn't always because they were brilliant players, although most of them were. Sometimes it was because they made you laugh. Sometimes it was because you trusted them. Sometimes it was simply knowing that if you were having a miserable day, that particular bloke would be sitting somewhere in the changing room when you got back. That's important in rugby. You spend an awful lot of time together, training, hotels, team buses, tours, sitting around waiting for matches. People watching from home don't really see that part. They see Saturday afternoon. We had each other for the rest of the week. So I thought about the question for a while. There are obviously more than 5. I've been very fortunate in that respect. But a few names came into my head almost immediately. Blokes I played with for England, blokes I toured with, blokes I laughed with and probably argued with once or twice as well. Actually knowing rugby players definitely more than once. But these are the 5 I remember with the most affection. And the first bloke who came into my head was Jeremy Guscott. Jeremy was one of those blokes you could take the mickey out of and he'd give it straight back. That's important, especially when you're a prop. We need entertainment. Now, Jeremy and I were completely different rugby players. Anybody who watched us for 5 minutes could work that out. He had all the nice stuff. The running, the balance, the hands. I mostly had a very large bloke pushing against my head. So naturally, I reminded him from time to time that backs had the easy job. He never agreed with me. Funny that, but what I liked about Jeremy was that you could actually talk to him. And I don't just mean about rugby. When you're together with England for years, you eventually run out of rugby conversations anyway. You talk about families, other players, something stupid somebody did at training, where you're going after the match. Normal things. Jeremy was good company. We'd have a laugh, we'd argue about things, and then we'd probably have another laugh about the argument. Even after the playing days, we'd still pick up the phone and have a chat. Sometimes there wasn't even a reason for it. Just, how are you? What are you doing? That sort of friendship means more to me now than it probably did when we were young. Because when you're playing, you think it'll all carry on forever. Same changing rooms, same faces, same jokes. Then one day it doesn't. Everyone goes off and gets on with life. So when somebody from those days still rings you, or you can ring them, and within 30 seconds, you're talking exactly the way you did 20 or 30 years ago, that's quite special. And that's Jeremy for me. Of course, he was a wonderful rugby player. I saw enough of him up close to know that, but that's not really why his name came into my head. I thought of the bloke first, the laughs, the conversations, the friendship that didn't disappear when we stopped putting an England shirt on. That's probably the best way I can put it. Jeremy was somebody I enjoyed playing rugby with, but more importantly, he was somebody I still enjoyed talking to when there wasn't any rugby left to play. Will was different. He had to be, really. He was captain at a very young age and suddenly everybody had an opinion about him. That's what happens when you're England captain. People who have never met you decide exactly what sort of bloke you are. I got to see the other side of it. Will and I played a lot of rugby together, and what I remember is how much responsibility he carried around with him. He didn't always show it, but you knew it was there. England was changing in those days. Rugby was changing. There was pressure everywhere, and Will was usually the bloke standing at the front answering the questions. The rest of us could disappear back into the changing room. He couldn't. I always respected that. But away from all that, he was just Will. We'd train, we'd have dinner, we'd sit around talking rubbish like everybody else. And he could take a joke. He had to. There were far too many forwards around for him not to. I probably gave him a bit of grief about being a centre. That's standard procedure for a prop. Backs think they're important because people can actually see what they're doing. We forwards know better. Will would normally have an answer ready. That's what made it fun. And I think that's the thing people sometimes forget about those England sides. From outside, we probably looked terribly serious. Inside the group, there was a lot of laughter. There had to be. You can't spend that much time together and talk seriously about rugby all day. You'd go mad. Will understood that he could be the captain when he needed to be, but he didn't spend every minute behaving like one. I liked that about him. When I think of those years now, I don't immediately think about him giving speeches or leading England onto the pitch. I think about all the ordinary time around it. Training, meals, sitting around, taking the mickey out of each other. That's where you really get to know somebody. And Will was somebody I was very happy to have around. He was my captain for a long time. But when I look back now, that's not really the first word that comes to mind. I remember the bloke. Lawrence could talk. God, he could talk. You could ask him what time training started, and somehow 10 minutes later, he'd still be explaining it to you. I used to give him plenty of stick about that. But Lawrence was also one of those blokes you wanted around when things got difficult. I remember touring with him with the Lions in South Africa in 1997. Lions tours are funny things because suddenly you've got players who spend most of the year trying to knock each other over, sharing breakfast every morning. For the first few days, everybody's working each other out. Then pretty quickly, the barriers disappear. Lawrence was never difficult to work out. What you saw was pretty much what you got. Confident, loud, competitive. Very confident, actually. He'd probably tell you that was one of his better qualities. But there was a good bloke underneath all of it. We played together for England for years after that, and there were plenty of occasions when things weren't going particularly well. That's when you notice certain people. Lawrence never disappeared. He wanted the ball. He wanted responsibility. Sometimes you wanted to tell him to shut up, obviously. But you never had to ask whether he cared. I liked that about him, and we laughed a lot. That's probably what I remember more now. People remember those England teams as being terribly focused, especially as we got closer to 2003. We were, but nobody can live like that every minute of every day. There were dinners, buses, hotel rooms, training sessions where somebody said something stupid and the whole thing fell apart for 5 minutes. Lawrence was usually somewhere near the middle of it. By 2003, we'd both been around long enough to know that none of this was going to last forever. I was getting towards the end. Lawrence wasn't exactly the young kid anymore either, although I'm sure he'd argue about that. And when I look back at him now, I don't really start with the matches. I remember the voice. I remember the laugh. I remember looking across a changing room and knowing Lawrence would have an opinion about whatever was happening. Usually several opinions. And strangely enough, I miss that. Don't tell him I said it. Jonny was a funny one because I think people sometimes imagined he walked around being Jonny Wilkinson all day. He didn't. He was just Jonny. Quiet bloke, very polite, probably too polite for some of the changing rooms we put him in, and completely obsessed with getting things right. I mean, completely obsessed. You'd finish training and most of us were thinking about food, a shower, maybe getting off our feet for a bit. Jonny would still be out there, kicking, then kicking again, then probably deciding the last kick wasn't quite right and doing another 20. I used to look at him and think, mate, you've got serious problems. But that was Jonny. There was nothing false about it. He wasn't doing it because the camera was watching him. Half the time, nobody was watching him. He just wanted to be better. And when you've been around rugby for a long time, you respect that. By 2003, I was the old man of the England squad. There wasn't much argument about that. I'd been around since 1990. My body had taken a fair bit of punishment, and I knew I wasn't going to be doing this forever. Jonny was at a completely different point. Everybody was talking about him. Every newspaper wanted him. Every supporter expected him to do something. But inside the group, he was still the same bloke. That's what I liked. The final in Sydney is obviously something people still ask about. And yes, I remember the kick. Of course I do. I was sitting there watching it like everybody else. But when I think about Jonny, I don't only see that moment. I see all the work nobody cared about. All those afternoons when the rest of us had finished and he hadn't. All those kicks when there wasn't a World Cup on the line and nobody was cheering. That's the Jonny I knew. He was younger than me, but there were things about him I admired enormously. And when my last England match was over, I was glad he'd been part of it. Because if you're going to finish your rugby life with a group of blokes beside you, you want people you trust. Jonny was certainly one of those. Jono was probably the easiest name on this list. And he'd absolutely hate me saying that. Martin wasn't really interested in people making a fuss about him. If you started telling him how wonderful he was, he'd probably look at you as if you'd lost your mind. That's partly why we got on. We had an odd relationship because at club level, we were on opposite sides. He was Leicester. I was Harlequins. So there were Saturdays when I'd spend 80 minutes trying to make his afternoon as unpleasant as possible. And he'd do exactly the same to me. That's rugby. You could be trying to take each other's heads off one week, then a few days later you're sitting beside each other in an England changing room. Nobody thought that was strange. Jono certainly didn't. Once you were wearing the same shirt, that was it. I trusted him completely. And trust is probably the best word I can use for Martin. He wasn't a bloke who needed to give you a 20-minute speech. Sometimes he'd barely give you 20 words. But you'd look at him before a big match and know exactly where you stood. No nonsense. No panic. Let's get on with it. We went through a lot together. England, Lions tours, good days, bloody awful days, and eventually that World Cup in 2003. By then we'd known each other for years. That's what made Sydney mean something different to me. People remember Martin lifting the trophy. I remember looking around afterwards and seeing blokes I'd shared a ridiculous amount of my life with. And Jono was right there. My last England match. His last England match. Neither of us knew standing together in that moment quite how strange life would feel once rugby wasn't waiting for us next Saturday. That's the bit that gets me now. I don't really miss packing down against Martin when Leicester played Quins. My neck certainly doesn't miss it. But I miss having him around. I miss knowing that somewhere in the changing room was this big miserable looking bloke who didn't need to say much because everybody already knew what he meant. We were opponents. We were teammates. And after enough years, he became something simpler than either of those. He was a mate. That's why Jono is number one. Looking back now, I suppose that's the strange thing about rugby. While you're playing, you don't really think about any of this. You don't sit in the changing room thinking, I'm going to miss these blokes one day. You'd get laughed out of the place if you said something like that. You're thinking about the match. You're thinking about whether your body's going to survive another week. You're wondering who's taking your bloody towel. Normal things. Then you stop playing. A few years go by, then a few more, and suddenly somebody asks you about those days. And the first things that come back aren't necessarily the things you'd expect. I remember Jeremy and the conversations, and I remember Will having to deal with all the noise that came with being England captain. I remember Lawrence talking, mostly Lawrence talking actually. I remember Jonny staying behind when everybody else had finished. And I remember Jono standing there looking like Jono, which usually meant he didn't need to say anything at all. That's what stays. Of course I'm proud of what we did. You don't play for England and go on Lions tours and then pretend none of that mattered. It mattered enormously. But the older you get, the results seem to move a little further away. The people don't. I'll bump into one of the old boys somewhere and within a couple of minutes we're taking the mickey out of each other again. Nothing changes. Well, apart from the hair and the knees. Definitely the knees. I've been very lucky with rugby. It gave me a career I never imagined I'd have. But more than that, it put some very good people in my life. These 5 are part of that. And if you ask me what I miss most about playing now, I wouldn't say Twickenham. I wouldn't say the big matches. I'd probably just say the changing room. Because that's where all the blokes were.